Today, I'm going to tell you an unbelievable story. A man was diagnosed with terminal cancer and got ready to die. But a medical mistake, a mistake, ended up saving his life. What was supposed to be the end turned into a miracle. And it all started on an ordinary afternoon. Before we dive in, if you like stories like this, the kind that gives you chills, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any videos like this one. Oh, and tell me in the comments, have you ever heard a story about someone who survived by a miracle when all hope seemed lost? Let's get started. His name was Richard Miller, but everyone called him Rick. A regular 37-year-old guy living in a quiet suburb in Ohio. Rick had a simple but happy life. He was married to Emily, and they shared not just a home, but dreams of a future together. Maybe opening a small coffee shop in town or traveling the country in an RV. Those dreams always came up on Friday nights when they'd crash on the couch, laughing at silly stuff, sipping cheap wine, and dreaming big. Physically, Rick was a strong man, broad-shouldered from growing up helping his dad at the family's auto repair shop. But in the last few weeks, that strength had vanished. Exhaustion had taken over. His skin looked pale, and his eyes, once full of life, seemed heavy. Emily noticed, but Rick kept brushing it off, saying it was just stress, work, bills, the grind. Then came a rainy September afternoon, and something snapped. Rick had been coughing non-stop, barely able to climb the stairs at home. Worried, Emily dragged him to the hospital. The sharp smell of disinfectant, the beeping of machines, the coldness of that place. Rick's stomach turned when he heard the doctor say, "Rick, we found something in your tests. We need to talk." His heart started racing. Emily gripped his hand tightly, like she already knew what was coming. A few minutes later, the news no one's ever ready to hear. Terminal cancer. Advanced stage. The words came out dry, cold. The doctor sounded like a robot programmed to deliver bad news. Rick felt his world fall apart. It was like the ground vanished beneath his feet. A buzzing filled his ears. Emily was crying silently, her face buried in her hands. And Rick could only think one thing: I can't die now. I can't leave Emily. The next few weeks were a blur. Appointments, tests, specialists, all saying the same thing. There was nothing they could do. It was a matter of months, maybe weeks. And Rick, well, he went back and forth between moments of strength and total despair. Sometimes he'd look up at the sky and beg for a miracle. Other times he'd lock himself in the bedroom and cry like a child. But what nobody knew, not even Rick, was that fate had other plans, and that a medical mistake, something that could have ended his chances for good, would actually be what changed everything. After that day at the hospital, Rick was no longer the same. The news of terminal cancer weighed on him like an anchor on his chest. It was like the whole world was in color, and he could only see shades of gray. The next morning, the sun was shining bright outside, but everything inside the house felt dark. Emily was trying to stay strong, but her red, swollen eyes gave her away. She went through the motions of making breakfast, toast, black coffee, like always. But Rick could barely swallow. His throat felt tight. He stared at his empty plate and thought about all the things he'd never get to live. He'd never see Emily grow old by his side, never open that little cafe they dreamed about, never meet the kids they once talked about having. How can life change so fast? He thought, feeling his chest tighten. The days that followed were the worst. Rick was forced into a routine of hospitals, doctors, and endless tests. Every waiting room felt like purgatory. The smell of alcohol, the sound of machines, the whispered conversations. It was all suffocating. His oncologist, Dr. Reynolds, was experienced but cold. He'd sit across from Rick and Emily with a clipboard in hand and a look that was part pity, part detachment. The kind of cancer you have is aggressive. It's already spread. Lungs, liver. There's not much we can do besides keeping you comfortable in this final stage. It was like a punch to the gut. Rick felt his breath catch. Emily started crying right then and there, not caring who was around. Dr. Reynolds, unsure of what else to say, added, "I recommend we begin palliative care. Maybe 6 months, no more than that." 6 months. Rick felt time slipping through his fingers. Every second turned into a premature memory of all he'd miss out on. Life outside kept moving, but he was no longer a part of it. That night, Rick locked himself in the garage. He sat in the seat of the old blue pickup truck he'd inherited from his dad and cried harder than he ever had in his life. The smell of grease, the old car posters on the walls, it all brought back memories of simpler times, when the biggest problem was an engine that wouldn't start. He grabbed a bottle of cheap whiskey and started drinking, feeling the burn in his throat. And for the first time, he seriously thought about ending it all before the cancer could do it for him. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily came into the garage, sat beside him, and silently held his hand. She didn't say a word, didn't try to comfort him. She just stayed there. And that was enough to keep Rick breathing. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said, her voice shaking. "But I promise I'll stay by your side till the end. And if there's even the slightest chance, any chance at all, we're gonna fight." Rick didn't answer, but inside, a tiny spark lit up. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to beat the odds. And that's how the toughest journey of his life began. A journey full of fear, pain, but also discoveries. Because what no one knew was that a simple mistake, a tiny overlooked detail, was about to change everything. In the days that followed, Rick decided he couldn't just sit back and accept the sentence. Something inside him, maybe love for Emily, maybe fear of dying, pushed him to keep trying, even knowing how slim the chances were. He started looking for alternatives, seeing new doctors, digging through every corner of the internet, searching for some glimmer of hope. He read about experimental treatments, alternative therapies, anything that sounded like a possible way out. That's how he found the renowned cancer center in Cleveland. There, a doctor named Dr. Patterson welcomed him in. A younger guy, the complete opposite of Dr. Reynolds. He spoke with enthusiasm, showed charts, explained options, though he always made sure to add, "The prognosis is still very poor, but we can try." Rick, with barely a shred of hope left, agreed to start an aggressive round of chemotherapy. The process was brutal. With every session, it felt like life was being drained from him. His hair started falling out, his skin turned yellowish, his eyes sunken. Emily was always there, sometimes holding his hand, other times just sitting close, trying her best to stay strong. But it was impossible not to fall apart, watching the man she loved wasting away right in front of her eyes. And then, it happened. The hospital was packed that Friday. Nurses rushed back and forth, barely keeping up. Rick was at the end of another infusion session when he noticed them swapping out the IV bags. The nurse, clearly exhausted, checked the papers quickly and hooked the new bag up to Rick's IV. He felt it immediately. The cold liquid running in, a weird sensation, different from all the other times. That metallic taste crept up his throat, and for a second he thought about calling someone, but his body, so weak, didn't respond. Minutes later, Dr. Patterson walked into the room, checked Rick's chart, and froze. The color drained from his face. "What did you give him?" he asked, voice trembling. The nurse went pale. Her eyes widened, and she nearly dropped the clipboard. "It was the bag from room 4, she whispered. "He's in room 3, the doctor shouted. Chaos broke out. Doctors and nurses started rushing in all directions. Rick, barely conscious, could hardly understand what was happening, but he could feel it. Something was very wrong. That afternoon, due to a simple misread, Rick had been given another patient's medication, an experimental drug that wasn't even part of his treatment protocol. A brand new medication, still in testing, developed for a different type of cancer altogether. The hospital tried to cover it up. The nurse was put on leave, and Rick's family received a formal apology. But for Rick, it just felt like one more sign that fate was against him. Emily snapped. She wanted to sue the hospital, screamed at the doctors, completely lost it. "How could you let this happen? He's already dying, and now you do this to him?" But Dr. Patterson, still visibly shaken, said something no one understood at the time. I need to monitor him. That drug, no one knows what it might do." Rick, somewhere between anger and exhaustion, could only think one thing: whatever. What else could possibly go wrong? Little did he know. That mistake, yes, that ridiculous mistake, would become the turning point no one could have seen coming. The days following the medical error were grim. Rick could barely get out of bed. His whole body ached, like every cell inside him was waging war. Intense nausea, high fever, and that terrifying sense that at any moment, everything could just stop. Emily never left his side. She spent sleepless nights staring at her husband's pale face, waiting for the worst. Twice, Rick nearly passed out and had to be rushed back to the hospital. Dr. Patterson seemed even more tense than usual. With each visit, he brought in a different team of doctors and researchers, all of them watching Rick like he was a walking experiment. No one said exactly what was going on. They just studied the test results, whispered in corners, then vanished. Until one morning, something strange happened. Rick woke up, hungry. For the first time in weeks, he actually wanted to eat. He looked over at Emily, who stared at him with swollen eyes from so much crying, and whispered, "Babe, can you make me those pancakes I like?" Emily couldn't believe it. For a second she thought he was delirious. But Rick gave her a weak smile and repeated, "I'm hungry. For real." She ran to the kitchen, shaking. As she mixed the batter, her heart was racing. It was a strange feeling, like something was about to change. Rick ate slowly, but he ate. And for the first time, he didn't throw up afterward. That same day, Dr. Patterson walked into the room. He had a confused look on his face, like he couldn't quite understand what was happening. "Rick, we need to talk." He sat down and took a deep breath before dropping the bomb. "Your test results, they're changing." Rick frowned. "What do you mean?" I don't really know how to explain it, but the tumor, it's starting to shrink." Silence filled the room. Emily covered her mouth, her face overcome with emotion. Rick just stared at the doctor, not sure whether to laugh or cry. Is that even possible?" he asked, voice trembling. "No, it wasn't supposed to be. But it's happening, and I need to be honest. The only thing that's changed is the wrong medication." Rick's stomach turned. That ridiculous mistake, that experimental drug, had it really caused this? Dr. Patterson nodded, as if he could read Rick's thoughts. "We're not completely sure, but I believe so. That drug, it was designed for a different type of cancer, but maybe, somehow, it's doing something in your body." That was the moment, for the first time in a long time, that Rick felt the spark of hope ignite again. Emily started crying, but not out of sadness. It was pure relief. She threw herself into Rick's arms, sobbing like a child. Rick looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "God, is this it? Is this the miracle I asked for?" From that moment on, everything changed. It was still too early to celebrate, but for the first time since the diagnosis, Rick didn't feel like he was just waiting to die. He was fighting, and for the first time, he actually felt like he could win. What they didn't know was that the biggest twists were still ahead. News of Rick's unexpected improvement spread through the hospital like wildfire. Doctors who'd never even crossed paths with him started showing up in his room, pretending it was just a courtesy visit. But they were all there for the same reason. His case was becoming a medical anomaly. Dr. Patterson was called into a meeting with the hospital board, and for the first time, Rick felt like something bigger was going on. There were whispers in the hallways, suspicious looks, and that feeling that he was no longer just a terminal patient. He was the centerpiece of a mistake that could either change medicine or destroy careers. The next morning, 2 men in suits knocked on Rick's hospital room door. They introduced themselves as representatives from the hospital's legal department. The conversation was stiff, awkward. "Mr. Miller, we'd like to discuss a confidentiality agreement. The hospital acknowledges the mistake, but we're willing to cover all your treatment and any necessary care as long as you don't speak about what happened here." Rick stayed quiet. He looked at Emily, whose face was already flushed with anger. "You want to silence me?" he asked, voice low but full of quiet fury. "That's not it. We just want to preserve the integrity of the institution and—" One of them started, But Rick cut him off. "You don't care about me. You're scared to death of what this could mean for you." They left the room, placing a contract on the table. But instead of signing it, as the hospital expected, Rick started asking questions. That same afternoon, Dr. Patterson came back into the room, looking like a defeated man. He slumped into the chair and said, almost in a whisper, "I had to tell you before you heard it from someone else. That medication, the one you got by mistake, it's still in testing. It's a new compound designed for a specific type of lymphoma. But in your test results, Rick, it's working." Rick's heart started to race. "Working how?" The doctor took a deep breath. "Your main tumor has shrunk by almost 40%. The metastases, some have disappeared. This is unprecedented." Emily started crying again, but this time it was different. It was a mix of relief, fear, and a glimmer of hope beginning to grow. "So, your mistake might have saved my life?" Rick asked, his voice cracking. Patterson nodded, eyes glassy. "I don't know how, but yes. Only thing is, this is a legal nightmare for the hospital. If this leaks out—" Rick cut him off. "I don't give a damn about the hospital, doctor. I want to live. And if this drug gave me any kind of chance, I want to keep going." That was the turning point. For the first time, Rick realized that maybe the worst mistake that hospital ever made was also the only real shot he had at surviving. "Doctor." Patterson looked Rick in the eyes and said something that would echo in his head for a long time. "I've never seen anything like this. Maybe you just became the most important patient of my entire career." Rick gave a faint smile, but this time there was something new shining in his eyes. Hope. The hospital wanted to bury that mistake, but what nobody there knew was that Rick was ready to go all the way. Because now, he wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger. That night, Rick couldn't sleep. Lying in the hospital bed, machines beeping, IV dripping slowly, he stared at the ceiling trying to make sense of how his life had flipped upside down so fast. On one side, terminal cancer and the certainty of death. On the other, that outrageous mistake, a drug no one really understood, but that, against every medical prediction, was working. Emily was asleep in an old recliner next to him, exhausted, but still holding Rick's hand. That was all he needed to make his decision. He wasn't going to just accept death as a done deal. He was going to fight till the very last second. The next morning, Rick asked to speak with Dr. Patterson alone. The doctor came in, already bracing for the worst. But what he heard changed the course of everything. "Doctor, I want to keep taking that experimental drug. Give me this chance. If I'm going to die, let it be while I'm trying." The doctor hesitated. It was risky. There was no protocol, no approval. But deep down, he knew. Rick was right. This was a 1 in a million shot, born out of a mistake. "Rick, this could kill you. And if I do nothing, I'll die anyway. I'd rather die fighting." Dr. Patterson took a deep breath and, for the first time, gave a small smile. "All right, let's fight." But the hospital didn't see it that way. When they found out Rick had refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement and wanted to continue the experimental treatment, the tone changed. That same afternoon, Rick was visited by a new team of directors and lawyers. This time, the proposal was different. They'd try to transfer him to another hospital under the excuse of seeking better treatment. But Rick saw right through it. They were trying to move him away to cover up what happened. Emily lost it. "You're not taking him out of here. Not now. Not when he actually has a chance." Things got heated. Rick looked straight at the hospital director and said with a steady voice, "If you take me out of here, I'll go to the press. I'll tell everything." That was enough to make the man swallow hard and walk out without saying a word. And it was in the middle of all that tension that the first big twist happened. In the middle of the night, while Emily slept and Rick tried to think through the chaos, Dr. Patterson walked into the room with a thick envelope. "Rick, I couldn't tell you before, but I made direct contact with the lab that developed the compound you received. They want to meet you. They want to study your case. They're willing to cover everything. But there's one catch. If you agree, this leaves the hospital's control. And from here on out, you're stepping into the eye of the storm." Rick was quiet for a long moment. This was the chance he'd been waiting for. But it also meant walking into a war. He looked at Emily, then back at Dr. Patterson, and said the sentence that would change everything. "I'm in. Take me to them. If this can save me, then let's go all the way." At that moment, Rick stopped being just a terminal patient. He became a living gamble, a human experiment that could change medicine or end everything for good. And what was coming, no one was ready for. 2 days later, a black van with tinted windows pulled up quietly behind the hospital. Rick, still weak, was placed in a wheelchair and taken to it like a prisoner being transferred. Emily didn't leave his side for even a second. The lab responsible for the experimental drug was called Lancer Biotech, a company few had ever heard of, but according to Dr. Patterson, it was backed by powerful investors. The building was 2 hours away, in an isolated location, almost as if the whole world needed to forget that this was even happening. When they arrived, Rick felt the full weight of the decision he had made. The place looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Cold hallways, white walls, the sharp smell of chemicals. Men and women in lab coats rushed around, barely lifting their eyes. They weren't there to care. They were there to study. Emily gripped Rick's hand tightly. "We're going to get through this. Together," she whispered. At the very first meeting, the head of the project, a cold man named Dr. Collins, made it clear. "Rick, from now on, you're a unique case, a living study. I can't promise you anything, only that we'll go all the way with you. But there's a price, absolute confidentiality, and you're gonna have to endure things you never imagined." Rick just nodded. He was already in hell. What were a few more steps? The tests started the next day. What Rick went through in the following weeks is hard to even describe. Invasive exams, biopsies, daily samples. They took so much blood, it felt like his body had nothing left to give. The lab wanted answers. How had the experimental compound produced that effect? It was a golden opportunity, and they were willing to push it to the edge. Rick felt his body wasting away. He lost weight, his skin turned yellow, his vision blurred. But every time he thought about giving up, he looked at Emily and found strength in places he didn't even know existed. The doctors, while breaking him down with the testing, also brought the updates that kept him going. The tumor is still shrinking, slowly but steadily. It was like walking a tightrope between life and death. The drug, which didn't even have an official name yet, was working. But Rick was paying a heavy price. The worst night came after a new cycle of the drug. Rick began convulsing. Emily watched in horror as the doctors held him down on the gurney, trying to keep him from hurting himself. His body shook uncontrollably, eyes rolling back, mouth foaming. Emily screamed, lab coats flew in every direction, machines beeped wildly. When it finally stopped, Rick was still, drenched in cold sweat, breathing heavily. Dr. Collins approached, almost emotionless, and said, "This is going to happen again. His body is trying to adapt. But if he can hang on, he might have a shot." Emily snapped. "This isn't treatment anymore. It's torture. You're going to kill him." But Rick, barely able to speak, whispered, "No, let them. I'm buying time. And that's all that matters." Emily broke down in tears. Because as cruel as it was, Rick was right. Every day he lasted was another day gained. And for someone who had already accepted death, that was everything. The weeks dragged on like an endless nightmare. Rick no longer knew if he was alive or dead. His body was a shadow of the man he once was. Skinny, bones poking through the skin, his eyes sunken and dull. But against all medical odds, the cancer kept retreating. Each new scan brought numbers the lab scientists couldn't explain. The drug was working, but it was destroying Rick in the process. Emily was the only one who still saw the man behind the frail shell. She fed him spoonfuls of warm soup, wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, and repeated every day like a mantra, "You're getting out of here. You're gonna live. We're gonna beat this." But the truth was, even Emily didn't believe it anymore. What kept Rick alive was her hope, and the fear that if he gave up, all that pain would have been for nothing. Then the inevitable happened. On a cold Monday morning, Rick woke up coughing up blood. A lot of blood. Emily screamed for help, and within seconds, the medical team stormed into the room. Dr. Collins stood back, analyzing the scene with his usual coldness, while the others tried to stop the bleeding. His body's reached its limit, Collins muttered. The drug, the dosage. Maybe we pushed it too far. Emily lost it. Maybe? He's going to die in here because of you. Collins met her gaze, not looking away. If we stop now, he dies. If we continue, he might die anyway. We're stuck. That's when Rick, between bloody coughs, did what no one expected. I want to stop. I'm done. Silence filled the room. Emily walked up to him, hands shaking. What? Rick looked at her with a calmness that felt like peace, like someone who had finally made peace with fate. I'm tired, Emily. I don't want to live like a lab rat anymore. If I'm going to die, I want to go home. I want to feel the sun, the wind. I want to look at you without wires and needles. Emily broke down. She cried like the world was ending. And maybe, in a way, it was. Dr. Collins tried to argue. Rick, if you stop now, you're throwing everything away. We can try adjusting the dose. We can... Rick raised his hand, weak but firm. No, doctor. It's over. I made it this far. I fought. But now, I want to live what's left on my own terms. Rick's decision caused chaos inside the lab. Investors started pressuring. The hospital called threatening to expose everything. But none of that mattered anymore. Emily packed their things, helped Rick get dressed, or at least tried, and the two of them walked out of that building like survivors of a war no one else had seen. As they left, Dr. Collins looked Rick in the eye one last time and said, "You're the strongest I've ever seen. Good luck, Rick." Truly. Rick gave a faint smile, without strength, but with something no one expected. Peace. In the car, Emily held his hand tight, like she could keep him alive just through touch. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rick looked out at the road, sunlight warming his thin face, and whispered, "Now, we live, one day at a time." What they didn't know was that this decision would be the real turning point, because sometimes it's only when we accept the end that life decides to surprise us. Rick and Emily got home on a cold autumn afternoon. The sky was gray, but to them, that was the color of freedom. For the first time in months, Rick breathed in the fresh air, felt the chilly wind on his face, and smiled. The days were tough. Rick could barely stand. Every movement was a struggle. Emily helped him bathe, fed him by hand. But he was there, home, alive. The family doctor showed up a few days later. He was shocked to see Rick so frail, but at the same time, impressed. "You shouldn't be here, Rick. Medically speaking, you were gone." Rick just gave a crooked smile. "Yeah, well, I'm still here. And honestly, I don't know for how long. But time seemed to stop. What was supposed to be the end became a quiet new beginning. Every day, Emily made sure to sit Rick out on the porch so he could smell the grass, hear the birds, watch the sky. Weeks passed like that, until one late afternoon, something happened. Rick started feeling hungry, but not that weak, vague hunger. Real hunger. He asked for a big burger, the kind he used to eat before all of this started. Emily laughed, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. Rick ate, and for the first time in months, didn't throw up. The next day, he woke up feeling stronger. He asked to take a walk around the block. Emily hesitated, but agreed. They went out slowly, arm in arm. Neighbors stared in disbelief. Some even cried seeing him walk again. And that was just the beginning. Without the weight of machines, without the torturous testing, Rick's body started to respond. The dark circles under his eyes faded, color returned to his face, and with each new day, he looked more alive. A week later, Rick had a crazy idea. "Take me to the hospital. I want to run a test. Just one." Emily thought it was nuts, but she went along. When they got there, old Dr. Reynolds nearly fell out of his chair when he saw Rick walk in. His eyes filled with tears, but pride kept him from showing it. They ran the tests, CT scan, MRI, blood work, 3 days later, the phone rang. It was Dr. Reynolds. His voice was shaking. "Rick, I don't even know how to say this. The tumor, it's gone. There's nothing there. Not even a trace. It's like it was never there at all." Emily dropped the phone. Rick closed his eyes and let the tears fall. It was the miracle, the unlikely, the impossible. The following week, Dr. Patterson showed up at their house, not as a doctor, but as someone who needed to see it with his own eyes. "I came to see you because I needed to believe," he said. Rick smiled. "Believe in what?" "That sometimes life wins, even when science doesn't have the answers." That day, the three of them sat on the porch in silence. No words were needed, because they all knew. Something much bigger had happened there. Rick survived. Not because of medicine, not because of science, but maybe, just maybe, because fate decided to give him one more shot. But the greatest lesson left behind is that life, as cruel as it can be, still knows how to surprise us. Time passed. Not just days or weeks, months, and against all odds, Rick didn't just survive. He came back to life. His hair started growing again. The once thin and worn-out face gained color. And his eyes, Rick's eyes were never the same. There was a different light in them now. A quiet kind of gratitude that only someone who's stared death in the face can truly carry. He and Emily finally fulfilled their long-time dream. They bought an old van and hit the road. No plans, no itinerary, just the two of them, driving across the country, living each day like it was their last. Because for them, tomorrow was never guaranteed again. On one of those trips, Rick pulled the van over at the top of a hill, the sun setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs, and turned to Emily. "If someone had told me I'd be here today, I wouldn't have believed it." Emily smiled, her eyes glassy. "But you are. And you know what? You won." Rick stayed quiet, staring out at the horizon. His words carried a weight only he knew how heavy it had been to bear. "I've learned that sometimes life has to break you completely, so it can rebuild you," he said. "And the craziest part is that the mistake that should have killed me ended up saving me." Emily squeezed his hand, and in that moment, there was no pain, no fear, no regret. There was only the now, the miracle of being there. Rick never went back to the lab. He never sued the hospital. He understood that some things just happen, and that the real miracle wasn't in the drugs or in medicine. It was in the chance to start over, to truly value what matters. What was once a death sentence became the push Rick needed to change his life, and his story became a source of hope for many. A few years later, Emily started a blog where she wrote about every step of the journey they had lived together. Thousands of people began to follow. People who, just like them, needed to believe that the impossible can, in fact, happen. Rick was invited to share his story. He gave talks, appeared in documentaries, became an inspiration. Not because he survived, but because he chose to truly live after everything. And the message he always left behind was simple but powerful. Life is now. It doesn't matter what they told you, what the diagnosis says, or what others believe. As long as you're breathing, there's still a chance. And sometimes, hope is born in the most unlikely places, even from a mistake. On that hill, watching the sun go down, Rick smiled. His chest light, his heart at peace. He survived. But more than that, he was reborn. And that is the greatest victory of all.